Hello again, Psych 370 students, and welcome to your first video lecture for week 11. So we've just wrapped up another unit of the course, which makes this the beginning of unit 4. And guys, the first thing on the agenda for this unit is going to be schedules of reinforcement, what we call schedules of reinforcement, which are covered in chapter 7 of the textbook. We're going to split that chapter up across this week and next, though. So we'll kind of ease into it this week. We'll focus on the first 10 pages or so this week, which are about providing an introduction to the concept of schedules of reinforcement and going over the 4 simple schedules of reinforcement. And then next week, we'll turn our attention to the rest of the chapter. Before we get into schedules of reinforcement, though, I want to kick things off here with a quick review of the contingency that characterizes operant conditioning. So remember, a contingency is basically an if-then statement, right? If this happens, then that will happen. Like if X occurs, then Y will occur. Or if X occurs, then Y is more likely to occur. That's called a contingency, right? So in classical conditioning, the contingency is just if the CS occurs, then the US occurs. If the conditioned stimulus occurs, then the unconditioned stimulus is more likely to occur. That's the contingency in classical conditioning. But like we talked about in the last unit of the course, in operant conditioning, the contingency is a bit more complicated because it does involve the animal's behavior. So the contingency in operant conditioning isn't if one stimulus occurs, then another stimulus occurs, like it is in classical conditioning. But it's also not if the response occurs, then the reinforcer occurs. Instead, the contingency in operant conditioning goes like this. If the discriminative stimulus is present, and if the animal also performs the response, then the reinforcer occurs. So what we have in operant conditioning is a 3-term contingency, which I told you that you could think of as an ABC contingency. So the A stands for antecedent. That's the thing that comes first. That's the discriminative stimulus. The B stands for behavior. So that's the response. That's the thing that the animal has learned to do. And the C stands for consequence. So that's the reinforcer or the punisher that's either going to strengthen or weaken the behavior in question. So guys, remember, with this ABC contingency in operant conditioning, it's basically A plus B equals C. So if the discriminative stimulus is present, and if the behavior also occurs while that discriminative stimulus is present, then the consequence occurs as a result. Now, for the most part, so far, I've been talking about operant conditioning like that 3-term contingency was perfect. I've talked about it like every single occurrence of the behavior in the presence of the discriminative stimulus got reinforced. But of course, in the real world, that's not always how things work. Some things we do get reinforced every time we do them, but many things don't. So guys, the first most basic distinction that we need to make here when it comes to schedules of reinforcement is between what we call continuous reinforcement versus what we call partial or intermittent reinforcement. Now, either way, a schedule of reinforcement is basically just a rule that dictates when a response in the presence of a discriminative stimulus will produce a reinforcer. So that's what a schedule of reinforcement is. It just defines more precisely the actual contingency between that response and that reinforcer. Like this is how many responses have to get made, or this is when the response has to get made to produce the reinforcer. And continuous reinforcement is really the simplest schedule of reinforcement that you could have. So continuous reinforcement is where every time the behavior occurs in the presence of the discriminative stimulus, the reinforcer occurs as a result. So A plus B always equals C. That's how continuous reinforcement works. And again, some behaviors do get continuously reinforced. So for example, every time I flip the light switch in my bathroom, the lights turn on. So that behavior is always followed by that consequence. But many behaviors don't get continuously reinforced. Many of the behaviors that we routinely perform get partially reinforced. They get intermittently reinforced. They get reinforced some of the times we do them and not every time. So for example, sometimes when you check your phone, you have an interesting text message or notification or something like that waiting for you, right? And other times you don't. So that behavior checking your phone, is subject to partial reinforcement, not continuous reinforcement. Similarly, if you play golf, then you don't sink every putt that you attempt, only some of them. If you gamble, then you win sometimes, and other times you don't. And if you ask somebody out on a date, then sometimes they say yes, and other times they say no. So all of those are examples of behaviors that get partially reinforced, not continuously reinforced. Now, our focus this week and next will primarily be on the different types of partial schedules, the different types of intermittent schedules that a particular behavior could get reinforced on. But continuous reinforcement does have one important advantage over partial reinforcement, which is that it typically leads to faster acquisition of new behaviors. So, acquisition, new learning, acquiring new behaviors, that typically occurs faster with continuous reinforcement than it does with partial reinforcement. So, when you're first shaping a new behavior, it's probably a good idea to begin with continuous reinforcement. So, for example, if you want to get a rat to dunk a basketball, well, then at least at first, you want to reinforce the rat every time it approaches that basketball, right? Because you want it to acquire that response quickly so that you can move on to the next step in the shaping process. And similarly, if you want to teach a child to brush their teeth before bedtime, then you're probably going to want to start out by reinforcing that behavior every time it occurs. You'll probably want to start out by reinforcing the kid every time they brush their teeth. So acquisition happens faster with continuous reinforcement because obviously, if a certain reinforcer always follows a certain behavior, then it's easy to recognize that, okay, when I do this, then this happens. As a result, you're going to form that association quickly. But the drawback to continuous reinforcement is that, yeah, acquisition happens quickly, but so does extinction. So, continuous reinforcement is a good way to establish a new behavior. But if you then stop reinforcing that behavior, so if you put the animal through extinction, where now the reinforcer no longer follows the behavior, then the animal will give up on that behavior more quickly. It'll stop performing that behavior more quickly than it would have if it had been on an intermittent schedule of reinforcement before you introduced that extinction phase. So, if you want a behavior to persist, if you want that behavior to resist extinction, if you want it to have a high amount of what we call resistance to extinction, then once the behavior has been acquired, then you're probably going to want to stop reinforcing it continuously and instead switch it over to a partial schedule, switch it over to some kind of intermittent schedule of reinforcement. So, for example, at first, you might praise your child or whatever every single time they brush their teeth before bed. But eventually, you'll want to phase out that continuous reinforcement schedule, right? You're eventually going to want to start praising the kid only occasionally when they brush their teeth. You're eventually going to want to transition them to a partial schedule of reinforcement like that, because that way the behavior of them brushing their teeth will be more likely to persist even in the absence of praise. So that partial schedule will make the behavior more resistant to extinction. Okay. So continuous reinforcement is where the behavior gets reinforced every time. Partial reinforcement or intermittent reinforcement is where the behavior gets reinforced only some of the time. And again, partially reinforced behaviors tend to persist for longer in the absence of reinforcement. That's the advantage of partial reinforcement. It results in behaviors that are more resistant to extinction than continuous reinforcement does. Now, that phenomenon is known as the partial reinforcement effect or the partial reinforcement extinction effect. And it's one of those things that we'll spend more time on next week. That's going to do it for this video lecture, though. So please let me know if you have any questions about continuous versus partial reinforcement, and I'll catch you next time. Take care, guys.